Welcome to Somnia Lore, your place for peaceful, sleepy adventures. Subscribe, hit the bell, like, comment, and share.
It began, strangely, in the silence between laughter, the kind of laughter that warms the air but leaves something lingering, something almost too heavy for words. I remember it as though the sound itself is woven into the fabric of night, tucked somewhere between the stars and the hush of the world. It was Tiny Rick's voice, bright and sharp, singing in a way that made everyone else smile but made Morty's chest tighten with unease. He couldn't explain it then, not fully, but he sensed the oddness beneath the joy, the shadow that flickered just out of sight. Childhood, after all, is full of mysteries we only learn to name much later. Morty would lie awake after such days, his eyes tracing patterns across the ceiling of his room. The stars beyond the window shimmered like secret lanterns. And sometimes he thought they whispered to him. Maybe it was imagination. Maybe it was something real. He didn't know, but he would listen, still and quiet, as though the universe itself was trying to tell him a story. Rick had always said the stars were just burning balls of gas, distant and indifferent. Yet Morty felt there was something more, some rhythm that pulsed just for him, and in that rhythm, he found comfort, even when the world felt uncertain. When Tiny Rick walked through the halls of school, bursting with songs and strange energy, Morty followed, half with admiration, half with worry. There was a charm in Rick's smaller form, youthful, lively, magnetic, and everyone seemed drawn to it. Teachers laughed at his quick wit, students cheered his antics, and for a moment, Morty wanted to believe it was as simple as it seemed. But then in the quiet, after the noise, Morty would notice the glimmer in his grandfather's eyes. Not quite joy, not quite peace. Something was off, as though behind the songs lived a silence too deep to ignore. That silence haunted Morty in a way he couldn't shake. At night, he would imagine Rick standing in the dark, carrying more weight than he ever let anyone see. Morty didn't understand it then, but he felt it. The way children sometimes sense truths they cannot yet explain. He wondered if laughter could hide sadness, if songs could carry cries for help disguised as melodies. These thoughts swirled softly, not sharp enough to hurt, but steady enough to stay. They became part of him, shaping the way he listened, the way he cared, the way he grew. Sometimes when the day was done, Morty would sit by the window and think of all the small things that made life strange and beautiful. Summer's footsteps in the hallway, the faint smell of sandwiches Rick left behind in the kitchen, the hum of the refrigerator that seemed to sing to itself in the night. All of it mattered, even if no one else noticed. Morty noticed. He carried those details like treasures. Not flashy or grand, but quiet and full of meaning. That was his way of holding on to people, to moments, to the fleeting mystery of being alive. Tiny Rick, with all his brightness, became part of those memories too. Morty remembered watching him strum a guitar, his voice light and playful, yet Morty could swear he heard a thread of longing woven through each note. No one else seemed to hear it. They clapped, they laughed, they shouted for more. Morty only listened, still and searching, feeling as though the song wasn't just music, but a secret message meant for him. He didn't know what the message was, not then, but it stayed with him. The seasons shifted slowly, as they always do, though Morty measured them less by calendars and more by feelings. Summer felt like the warm glow of Rick's experiments bubbling in the garage, a strange comfort in the smell of smoke and sparks. Autumn was the sound of leaves brushing the windows while Morty lay awake, thinking about what it meant to grow older. Winter carried silence, long and patient, a silence that echoed the kind he heard in Tiny Rick's laughter. And spring was the return of light, blossoms opening like secrets whispered by the earth. Through each season, Morty carried the same question: why did joy sometimes feel like sorrow in disguise? One evening, Morty asked Rick about it, though his words came out softer than he intended. When you laugh, do you ever feel sad at the same time? Rick didn't answer right away. He only looked at Morty, his eyes glassy, as though he were staring both at his grandson and at something far beyond him. Then with a half-smile, he said, "Kids, sometimes laughter's the only way to keep the sadness from eating you alive." Morty nodded, not because he fully understood, but because he felt the truth in it. That night, the stars whispered louder than usual, and Morty stayed awake listening until he drifted into dreams. The dreams were strange, as dreams often are. He saw Tiny Rick dancing in a room filled with mirrors. Each reflection showed him smiling, laughing, singing, but behind every smile was a shadow, a taller figure, older, heavier. Morty walked closer, but the reflection shifted away, always out of reach. When he woke, the dream clung to him like mist. He didn't speak of it, but he remembered. He always remembered. Over time, Morty's memories of Tiny Rick became less about the songs themselves and more about the feelings they stirred. A melody hummed in the back of his mind whenever he felt alone. A line of lyrics surfaced when he needed courage. The songs were strange, Yes, but they carried something, a reminder that joy and sadness could live side by side, that maybe they even needed each other. Morty didn't think of himself as wise, but he knew this. He would keep listening, even when no one else did. It was in those listening moments that Morty began to grow in ways he didn't yet notice. He became softer, more attentive, more aware of the undercurrents flowing beneath people's words. He could feel when Summer was pretending to be fine, but wasn't. He could sense when Rick's silence was heavier than usual. And he could see in himself the way memories shape the present, not by force, but by gentle persistence. Tiny Rick had left more than songs behind. He had left echoes, and Morty was learning how to follow them. And so Chapter 1 closes not with answers, but with quiet wonder. Morty's nights stretched long, filled with stars that whispered and memories that hummed. Tiny Rick's laughter still floated in his mind, bright but edged with mystery. Morty didn't fear it. He carried it, gently, the way one carries a lullaby into sleep. For in the quiet of those hours when the world slowed and the sky leaned close, he felt a truth too tender to put into words, that even shadows can hold light, and even sorrow can teach us how to love. And with that thought, Morty closed his eyes, drifting slowly into the dreamlike rhythm that would carry him forward. The story had only just begun. The night after that dream, Morty felt the quiet in his room deepen, as if the walls themselves were leaning in to listen. The memory of Tiny Rick's laughter still floated around him like smoke, not gone, not clear, just there. He turned on his side, pulled the blanket closer, and wondered why certain sounds refused to leave. Some memories fade like chalk in the rain, but others stay etched in us, carved in places we don't even notice until much later. Morty didn't know why this one clung to him, but he sensed it mattered, even if he couldn't say how. The next day unfolded gently, with the rhythm of an ordinary morning. The smell of coffee drifted from the kitchen, Rick tinkered in the garage, and Summer sighed at her phone, as though the weight of the whole world lived in the scrolling of her thumb. Yet for Morty, everything felt layered, like the day was just a surface stretched thin over something deeper. He walked through it quietly, listening, watching, holding space for what most would miss. His mind wandered back to the stars that whispered, to Rick's half-smile when he spoke about laughter and sadness, to the strange, heavy dreams that stayed behind his eyes. At school, Morty carried that same feeling. The classrooms hummed with chatter, the air thick with the smell of paper and pencil dust. But for him, it was all slightly distant. He caught himself watching people the way one watches waves, seeing how they rose, how they fell, how something unspoken lived beneath their movements. His teachers' voices droned, but he noticed the pauses between their words. His classmates laughed, but he saw who laughed with their eyes, and who laughed only with their mouths. And every so often in the background of it all, he heard echoes of Tiny Rick's guitar, faint as a memory slipping through a half-open door. It was during lunch, sitting alone at a table, that Morty realized something about himself. He didn't mind being quiet. He didn't mind watching, noticing, holding the details others let pass by. It made him feel connected in a different way, not by speaking, but by understanding. He remembered Rick's sandwiches, hastily made, sometimes burnt, yet eaten with a kind of weary devotion. He remembered Summer's sighs late at night, long and deep when she thought no one else was awake. These details mattered to him. They made people real. They made the world softer. When he got home, Rick was humming in the garage, surrounded by sparks and strange contraptions. Morty stood at the doorway for a moment, watching. Rick didn't look up right away, but his hum carried a rhythm that reminded Morty of the dream. The mirrors, the laughter, the shadows hiding in plain sight. "Hey Rick," Morty finally said, his voice careful. Rick grunted in reply, still bent over the workbench. "Do you ever feel like memories are talking to you? Like they're alive somehow?" Rick paused, then chuckled dryly. "Kid, memories don't talk. They just sit there waiting for you to trip over them." Morty nodded slowly, but deep down he felt otherwise. He thought memories did speak, just not in words. That night, the stars were clear again, bright and unblinking. Morty opened his window and let the air drift in, cool against his skin. He thought of what Rick said, and he thought of how wrong and right it felt at the same time. Memories might not talk like people do, but they had voices. Soft, hidden, carried in songs and silences, in the way a shadow lingered too long in someone's smile. He closed his eyes and let those voices surround him, like lullabies from another world. In his dream, he returned to the memory, well, though he didn't yet know its name. It appeared as a shimmering pool in the middle of a quiet field, the water glowing faintly as though lit from within. Morty knelt beside it and saw his reflection, but it shifted, younger, older, laughing, frowning. Behind him, faintly, he heard Tiny Rick strumming again, his song playful, yet trembling. Morty reached toward the water and ripples spread, showing scenes from his own life. He saw himself as a small boy, clinging to Summer's hand in a crowd. He saw Rick lifting him onto his shoulders, muttering impatiently but holding him steady. He saw moments of silence, of loneliness, of laughter that didn't quite fit. Each ripple felt alive, carrying not just images but feelings, bittersweet, tender, unspoken. When he woke, Morty felt different. Not older exactly, but changed in some quiet way. He carried the dream with him like a secret. At breakfast, Rick barely looked up from his mug, but Morty studied his face. He noticed the way Rick's hands shook slightly before steadying. He noticed how the lines around his eyes deepened when he forced a smirk. Morty didn't say anything, but he understood more than he had before. Summer sat across the table, her hair tangled, her gaze lost somewhere far beyond the room. Morty reached for the orange juice and poured her a glass without a word. She blinked, surprised, then gave him a faint smile. It was small, but it felt important. Days passed, each carrying a quiet rhythm, and Morty kept listening. He listened to the spaces between Rick's muttered jokes. He listened to the sighs in Summer's laughter. He listened to the silence of his own heart when he felt unsure of where he fit. The echoes of Tiny Rick's songs never left him, sometimes bright, sometimes heavy, but always there, guiding him in ways he couldn't yet explain. One evening, Morty wandered into the backyard alone. The air was cool, filled with the smell of grass and distant rain. He lay down and stared at the sky. The stars seemed endless, scattered like forgotten memories across the dark. Do you ever wonder, he whispered to himself, if the stars remember us the way we remember them? The question drifted into the night, unanswered, but it didn't matter. It felt good just to ask. In that stillness, Morty realized something gentle but true. His memories weren't burdens, they were lanterns. Even the heavy ones carried light, showing him how to see, how to feel, how to care. And maybe that was why Tiny Rick's laughter stayed with him. It wasn't just a sound from the past, it was a reminder. A lantern he would carry forward, lighting paths he hadn't yet walked. As the night deepened, Morty let his eyes close, knowing that tomorrow would bring new ripples, new whispers, new memories to hold. The world was strange, yes, but it was also tender. And he, in his quiet way, was learning how to move through it with open hands, ready to catch whatever fell. The silence folded around him like a blanket, soft and steady. He breathed slow and easy and felt the weight of the day dissolve. Somewhere in the distance, he thought he heard a faint guitar string plucked, a sound too delicate to name. Maybe it was memory, maybe it was dream. Morty didn't need to know. He only needed to listen. And with that, he drifted into sleep once more, carrying with him the gentle truth he had begun to discover, that even in silence the world is always singing. The faint hum of the world lingered in Morty's ears as he stirred from sleep. A hum so soft it was almost like the air itself was singing. For a moment he lay still, letting the sound fold around him, unsure whether it belonged to the dream he had just left or to the waking world that waited outside his window. The memory well lingered in his thoughts, shimmering like a secret he wasn't ready to speak aloud. He could still see the ripples spreading, still hear the faint strum of a guitar hiding in the silence. Even as sunlight crept across his room, it all felt too real to dismiss. Morty rose slowly, his body heavy with the kind of tiredness that dreams leave behind. He moved through the morning quietly, brushing his teeth, pulling on his shirt, hearing Summer's footsteps thudding impatiently in the hallway. The kitchen was alive with the familiar clutter of Rick banging pans and muttering to himself. Morty sat at the table, half listening, half drifting, his mind still tethered to the whispers of the night. Rick glanced at him briefly, eyes narrowing. "You look like you've seen a ghost, kid," Morty shrugged, not sure how to explain. How could he describe the feeling of memories that breathed, of songs that seemed to follow him across the line of sleep and wakefulness? School felt different that day. It wasn't that the teachers taught anything new or that his classmates acted any less ordinary. It was Morty who had changed. Every voice seemed to carry a double meaning. Every laugh felt tinged with something unseen. When a friend told a joke, Morty smiled, but he also noticed how quickly the boy's eyes darted away, as if hiding something fragile. When Summer passed him in the hallway, pretending not to notice, Morty caught the way her fingers clenched around her books, her knuckles pale with some quiet worry she would never speak aloud. And in the middle of it all, he thought he heard it again, a faint, playful tune rising and falling like Tiny Rick's voice. It wasn't really there, not in any way others could hear, but for Morty, it was unmistakable. Later, sitting in the cafeteria, Morty let his gaze drift across the crowd. His classmates moved like waves again, some laughing loudly, others retreating into silence. He watched them the way he had watched the ripples in the memory. Well, each movement carrying its own story. He felt no urge to interrupt or draw attention. He only wanted to witness, to hold these moments as they were. In a strange way, it gave him comfort, like being a quiet keeper of details that would otherwise vanish. He remembered Rick's words about laughter, how it could be armor, a shield against sorrow. Looking around, Morty realized how true that was, how many smiles held shadows underneath, and instead of feeling overwhelmed, he felt gentle. It was as though his heart had stretched, soft enough to hold both the laughter and the sadness at once. That evening, Rick surprised him by calling him into the garage. "Hey, Morty," Rick said, voice sharp but tired. "I need you to hand me that wrench." Morty did, watching as Rick tightened bolts on a half-finished machine. The glow of the contraption filled the room with shifting colors, painting Rick's face in hues that made him look younger, older, and utterly human all at once. "You ever think," Morty began hesitantly, "that sometimes people hide what they're really feeling? Like maybe they don't even know they're doing it?" Rick didn't answer at first. He kept working, the sound of metal on metal echoing in the small space. Then finally he muttered, "Everyone hides something, Morty. Some people hide it so deep they forget it's even there. Doesn't mean it's gone." Morty nodded slowly, letting the words sink in. The silence that followed felt heavy but not cold, more like the silence of stars, vast and watchful. That night, Morty dreamed again. This time, the memory well was deeper, its waters darker, but no less alive. He leaned over the edge and saw reflections, not just of himself, but of Rick too. Rick laughing loudly, Rick working tirelessly, Rick slumped in exhaustion, staring at nothing. Tiny Rick appeared beside the pool, strumming his guitar, the song light on the surface, but trembling underneath. Morty wanted to reach out, to ask what the song meant, but the words froze on his lips. Instead, he listened, letting the music wash over him. Each note seemed to carry both joy and sorrow, like two voices singing the same song in harmony. When he woke, Morty carried the dream like a fragile flame. He didn't tell anyone, but it shaped the way he moved through the day. He poured Summer's juice again at breakfast without being asked. He lingered a little longer in the hallway at school to hold the door for someone struggling with books. He sat quietly with Rick in the garage, just listening to the hum of the machines, without pressing for explanations. These weren't grand gestures, but they felt important. They felt like ripples from the well, spreading outward in ways he couldn't yet measure. Over time, Morty noticed something else. His silence itself had become a kind of language. People responded to it, though they didn't realize why. Summer's sighs softened when Morty was near. Rick's muttering grew less harsh when Morty simply sat and stayed. Even his classmates seemed to gravitate toward him during quiet moments, as though they sensed he could hold space for things unspoken. Morty didn't fully understand it, but he didn't need to. It was enough to notice, enough to let it be. And yet through it all, the echo of Tiny Rick's song remained. Sometimes it came as a faint hum when Morty was alone. Sometimes it threaded through the laughter of others, weaving shadows into light. It wasn't haunting exactly, but it wasn't comforting either. It was something in between, a reminder that joy and sorrow are never far apart, that one can give shape to the other. Morty held that truth close, not as a burden but as a lantern, glowing softly as he walked through the days. As the chapter of his life unfolded, Morty began to sense that he was on a journey, though not the kind filled with battles or victories. His was quieter, gentler, shaped not by grand events but by the way he learned to see. He didn't think of himself as a hero, not in any way Rick would define it, but in his own quiet way he was becoming something just as important, someone who could listen, someone who could notice, someone who could hold the unspoken songs of the world. The night came again as it always did, folding the day into its dark embrace. Morty lay in bed, eyes half closed, breathing steady. The stars blinked above him, distant yet near, silent yet singing, and in the space between his thoughts he heard it again, the faint strum of a guitar, playful, trembling, alive. He smiled softly, not with answers but with acceptance. The song was part of him now, as much as the stars, as much as the silence, and with that thought, he drifted into sleep, carrying the melody into his dreams. The night drifted away like a soft tide, and morning came quietly, wrapping Morty's world in pale light. He stirred slowly, blinking at the glow that crept across his room, his body still heavy with the residue of dreams. The faint strum of that unseen guitar lingered in his chest, as though carried over the threshold of sleep. Morty lay still for a while, listening to the silence, feeling how it pressed in with both comfort and mystery. He didn't mind it. Silence, he was learning, often said more than words ever could. When he rose, the house was already awake in its familiar rhythm. Summer's hurried footsteps crossed the hallway. Rick's muttering rattled through the walls, and the faint smell of something toasted, perhaps burnt, drifted from the kitchen. Morty sat at the table, his gaze drifting to the condensation gathering on his glass of milk. Summer slipped into the chair opposite, her eyes shadowed by something unspoken. She didn't say much, just poked at her cereal absent-mindedly. Morty noticed, but he didn't press. Instead, he let the silence grow comfortable, like a blanket between them. Sometimes the best way to understand someone was not to ask, but simply to sit close enough that they felt less alone. At school, the day unfolded with its usual noise, yet Morty moved through it differently, as though carrying an invisible thread that tied him to others. He didn't chase conversations, but he noticed when someone's laughter cracked at the edges. He didn't call attention to himself, but when a classmate dropped their pencil, he picked it up without a word. Small gestures, simple and quiet. Still, each one felt like it mattered. They reminded him of what Rick had once said, that everyone hides something. Morty was beginning to see those hidden things more clearly now, not as flaws, but as parts of people's stories. It was Summer who brought the next lesson. One afternoon, she stormed into her room, slamming the door so hard the walls trembled. Morty hesitated outside, torn between leaving her in peace and stepping closer. In the end, he knocked gently. "Go away," she muttered, but Morty stayed, his hand resting against the door. "I'm not gonna bug you," he said softly. "I'll just sit here." And so he did, leaning against the wall, waiting in silence. Minutes stretched, and the air grew heavy, but eventually the door creaked open. Summer's eyes were red, her voice sharp. "Why are you still here?" Morty met her gaze quietly. "Because you didn't really want to be alone." She didn't reply, but after a moment, she let him inside. They sat together on her bed, not talking at first. Summer fiddled with a bracelet. Morty stared at the ceiling. Then slowly she began to speak, not about the details, but about the weight of feeling misunderstood, unseen, tangled in expectations too big for her small frame. Morty listened without interruption, letting her words spill into the space. He didn't always understand her, but he understood her heart, and that was enough. When she finally fell silent, he simply said, "Yeah, I get it." Summer leaned back, her breathing steadier, and for the first time in days she smiled. It wasn't a bright smile, but it was real. That night Morty thought about how strange it was that silence and listening could feel like acts of love. He remembered Tiny Rick's songs, how they carried both joy and sorrow at once. Maybe people were like that too. Melodies layered with laughter, tears, and everything in between. Morty drifted to sleep with that thought, the stars outside his window watching quietly as though nodding in agreement. In his dreams, the memory well returned, but this time Summer stood beside him. Her reflection shimmered in the water, changing with each ripple. A child clutching a stuffed toy, a teenager with tired eyes, a woman not yet grown, but already carrying too much. Morty glanced at her and saw her watching, not afraid, just curious. "Is that really me?" she asked, though her voice sounded more like thought than speech. Morty nodded. "Yeah, but it's not all of you. It's just pieces." The water stirred, and for a moment, Tiny Rick's song floated across its surface, playful and aching. Summer tilted her head. "It's a sad song, isn't it?" Morty hesitated. "Yeah, but it's also kind of beautiful." She didn't answer, only slipped her hand into his, and together they listened until the dream dissolved. When he woke, Morty carried that dream like another lantern in his chest. At breakfast, he caught Summer's eye, and without words, they shared a small smile. Rick was too busy fiddling with his latest invention to notice. But that didn't matter. Some things weren't meant for everyone. Some things were just meant to be kept between those who understood. The day stretched on, ordinary in its details, yet Morty moved through it with a growing sense of connection. He held doors, offered pencils, shared quiet glances with Summer, and listened to Rick's mutterings with patience. Each act, however small, felt like another ripple from the memory, well spreading outward, touching more than he could see. That evening, Morty sat outside again, watching the stars. The air was cool, carrying the faint scent of earth and grass. He thought about Summer, about Rick, about the way everyone carried shadows in their smiles, and he thought about Tiny Rick's song, how it seemed to echo through all of it, threading sorrow and joy into something whole. He wondered if maybe that was the point, that life wasn't about choosing one or the other, but learning how to carry both, gently at the same time. The thought settled into him like a lullaby, soft and steady. He breathed deeply, letting the night fold around him, and felt the world slow. Somewhere, faintly, he thought he heard the strum of a guitar once more, drifting through the stars. He smiled, eyes closing, the melody carrying him towards sleep. And in that drift, Morty knew this, that bonds are not built by grand gestures, but by quiet presence. That sometimes the greatest gift you can give is simply to stay. And as he surrendered to dreams, he carried the warmth of summer's hand in his, and the song of tiny Rick lingering like a lantern in the dark. Morning returned with a quiet gentleness, and Morty found himself waking not to the noise of Rick's inventions or Summer's hurried footsteps, but to the soft hum of silence. It was a silence that felt alive, as though the world itself was holding its breath, waiting for something just beyond his reach. Morty sat up slowly, rubbing his eyes, and for a moment he thought he could still hear that distant strum of a guitar, faint and fading, like an echo carried from a dream. It lingered, reminding him that not all melodies disappeared with waking. Some stayed, etched deep, waiting to resurface when needed most. Downstairs, the morning unfolded in the usual blur of clinking dishes and half-spoken arguments. Rick sat slouched over the kitchen table, tinkering with a small device that sparked faint blue light across its surface. Summer scrolled through her phone, her brow furrowed but her presence calmer than it had been in days. Morty slipped into his chair, glancing between them, and noticed how the silence he carried seemed to soften the edges of the room. Rick muttered something about entropy not waiting for breakfast, but Morty didn't answer. He simply listened, taking in the rhythm of their breaths, the scrape of toast, the faint hum of Rick's device. It felt strangely grounding, as if the quiet itself was weaving them closer together. At school, Morty's awareness sharpened in ways he hadn't expected. He noticed the way his teacher's hands trembled ever so slightly when holding chalk, the way a classmate's smile faltered as though hiding a storm beneath it, the way even laughter carried shadows when you listened closely enough. Morty didn't try to solve these hidden things, but he carried them with care, acknowledging them silently. When someone dropped their papers in the hallway, he knelt to help without needing thanks. When another kid muttered an insult under their breath, Morty didn't snap back. Instead, he looked at them quietly, and in that gaze there was no anger, only a kind of gentle knowing. It unsettled some, softened others, but in all cases it left ripples, faint but undeniable. The real shift came later that evening. Rick had been unusually restless, pacing his lab with a kind of tension Morty had rarely seen. Infinite probabilities, infinite collapses. Rick muttered, his hands gesturing wildly as if trying to contain thoughts too large for words. Morty lingered by the door, watching his grandfather's agitation with a quiet patience. Normally Rick would snap at him for hovering, but this time Morty simply stood still, saying nothing, letting the silence stretch like a net strong enough to catch the weight Rick carried. After a while, Rick stopped pacing. His shoulders slumped. He glanced back at Morty, eyes glassy with exhaustion, and for the briefest moment he looked less like the unshakable genius, and more like a tired man searching for rest. Morty didn't move, didn't press, didn't ask. He only stayed. That was enough. Rick sighed, muttered something under his breath about damn kids and their quiet wisdom, and turned back to his work with a little less edge in his movements. Later that night, Morty found himself outside again, staring at the endless sprawl of stars. Summer joined him, wordless, settling on the grass beside him. The cool air carried a stillness that felt alive, the crickets chirping softly in the distance. Summer broke the silence first. Do you ever feel like the world's just too loud? Morty glanced at her, then back at the stars. Yeah, but sometimes the quiet makes more sense. She nodded, hugging her knees. It's weird. When you're quiet, people actually notice stuff. Like it makes them stop. Morty smiled faintly. Maybe that's what people need sometimes. Just someone to stop with them. Summer didn't answer, but she leaned against him, her weight steady, and together they listened to the hum of the night. That evening's calm carried into Morty's dreams. Once again, the memory well appeared, shimmering with reflections that shifted and blurred. This time, Rick stood at its edge. His reflection flickered with countless versions of himself, laughing, weeping, building, destroying, each a different shard of the same man. Morty stood beside him, watching quietly. Rick frowned at the water, muttering, nothing but ghosts of bad choices. Morty shook his head gently. Not just bad choices, it's everything. The good, too. Rick scoffed, but Morty noticed how his reflection softened, the edges less sharp. For a moment, Morty thought he heard tiny Rick's guitar strum, faint and fleeting, rippling across the water's surface. Rick glanced at him, half-smile tugging at his lips. You hear it too, huh? Morty nodded. And in that shared silence, something passed between them, an understanding too deep for words. When morning came again, Morty carried the dream with him, like a lantern glowing quietly inside. At breakfast, he noticed Rick less restless, Summer more at ease, even his parents speaking without their usual sharp edges. The house felt lighter, though nothing had really changed, or maybe everything had. Morty realized then that change wasn't always loud or sudden. Sometimes it was the accumulation of small silences, of quiet acts, of presence that lingered. Throughout the day, Morty leaned into that truth. He smiled at strangers without reason, offered help without waiting to be asked, and listened with a patience that surprised even him. It wasn't about fixing anyone or proving anything. It was about holding space, about letting the quiet be enough. By evening, as the stars rose again, Morty understood something he hadn't before. The guitar's melody wasn't fading. It was settling into him, becoming part of who he was. And as he lay down to sleep, Morty whispered into the stillness, not to Rick, not to Summer, not even to himself, but to the unseen melody that had guided him all along. I hear you. I'll keep listening. The night accepted his words without reply, folding around him like a blanket, and somewhere, far off, the guitar strummed once more. Gentle, steady, endless. The next morning, the world seemed to rise with a slower breath, as if it too was learning the rhythm Morty had begun to carry. The light slipped through the curtains in soft ribbons, dust motes drifting like little planets caught in their own orbits. Morty lay still for a while, watching them float, listening to the quiet thrum of the house as though it were a living thing. He thought of the dream, of Rick at the edge of the shimmering well, of the reflections that carried both his failures and his triumphs. Morty knew the dream was more than just his imagination. It was a reminder, a fragment of something woven deeper than sleep. Downstairs, Rick was already at the table, not hunched with manic energy, but sitting almost still, his mug steaming faintly. He didn't speak when Morty entered, but he didn't need to. The silence between them felt fuller now, as though words would have been a disruption instead of a bridge. Summer joined them a moment later, her hair messy, her phone abandoned. They sat together in that unspoken quiet, and Morty realized that sometimes peace didn't arrive with fireworks, but with the simple act of sitting side by side, letting the moment exist. At school, Morty felt a new layer of awareness settle around him. The noises of the hallway, the slamming lockers, the shuffle of feet, the bursts of laughter no longer overwhelmed him. Instead, they unfolded like a rhythm, each sound part of a larger song. He noticed small things again, the way one student lingered by the window as if waiting for something unseen, the way another nervously tapped their pen to keep from trembling, the way a quiet voice in the back of the class whispered answers to themselves too shy to raise their hand. Morty didn't intervene, but he carried those details, each one like a thread woven into him. It was as if he had become a keeper of unseen moments, holding them gently until the world was ready to notice. Later that evening, Rick called him into the garage. "Morty," Rick muttered, gesturing to a machine covered in wires and glass panels. "This thing here, it doesn't work the way it's supposed to. Every time I think I've got it stable, it shows me something else. Versions of myself, versions of you, versions of this whole family. Not timelines, not dimensions, just echoes. You ever get the feeling some echoes don't leave?" His voice cracked slightly, buried under his usual grumble. Morty stepped closer, studying the faint flicker of light within the glass. He didn't need to understand the machine. He could already feel the truth of it. "Maybe they're not supposed to leave," he said softly. Rick frowned, half angry at the simplicity, half struck by it. "That's not science, Morty. That's—" He trailed off, shaking his head, but he didn't turn away from the boy. That night, the dream returned stronger. Morty stood at the well again, but this time Summer was with him. The water reflected not only Rick's many selves, but theirs as well. Summer laughing, crying, silent, screaming. Morty reached for her hand without thinking, and she took it. The reflections rippled, then stilled, as though acknowledging the bond between them. "What do you see?" Summer asked quietly. Morty swallowed. "I see us. All the ways we've been. All the ways we could be." Summer squeezed his hand. "Do you think it matters which one is real?" Morty hesitated, then shook his head. "Maybe they all are. Maybe they're all just pieces of us." The well hummed almost like approval, and the melody of Tiny Rick's guitar strummed faintly again, threading the dream together with a gentle persistence. When Morty woke, his chest ached in a way that wasn't pain, but memory pressing against him, reminding him of things too fragile to name. He carried it through the day, through small interactions, through the way he noticed the people around him without needing to change them. Rick seemed calmer too, though he would never admit it. Summer was quieter but less guarded, like someone learning to trust silence again. By the evening, Morty found himself outside beneath the stars once more. He stretched out on the grass, arms spread wide, breathing in the night. The cool air wrapped around him like a second skin. And for the first time in a long time, he felt as though he belonged not just in his family, not just in his world, but in something vast and unnameable. The stars didn't answer, but they seemed to listen. And as Morty's eyes drifted shut, he thought again of the guitar, of the well, of the echoes that never left. He whispered softly, so quietly the words were almost part of the wind. "I'll keep listening. I promise. And in the stillness that followed, the melody came again, patient and unbroken, carrying him into sleep. The night had folded Morty into its calm embrace, and when morning arrived, it carried with it a subtle shift, as though the air itself remembered the promise he had whispered to the stars. He woke slowly, not startled by alarms or voices, but gently, as if the day itself was reluctant to disturb him. For a long moment he remained in bed, eyes half closed, listening to the faint creaks of the house, the way the walls seemed to breathe, the steady thump of someone moving downstairs. It all felt woven into the same quiet song that had been following him for nights now, the soft echo of that unseen guitar. Rick was already in the garage, the hymn of machines drifting through the walls like distant thunder. Morty patted in, rubbing his eyes, and saw his grandfather bent over the device again, the one with glass and wires that shimmered with faint light. Rick glanced up briefly, then returned to his work, muttering, "Morty, you ever notice that silence isn't empty? It's just full of things you don't know how to measure yet." His voice was softer than usual, almost distracted. Morty tilted his head, watching the machine pulse. "Maybe you're not supposed to measure it. Maybe you're just supposed to hear it." Rick gave him a look, halfway between annoyance and reluctant admiration, but didn't argue. Instead, he flicked a switch, and the device hummed louder, rippling with flashes that looked almost like water catching starlight. Later that day, Morty drifted through school like a boy caught between two worlds. Everything around him felt sharper in detail, yet softened by the way he now understood it. He noticed the quiet bravery of a student standing up for someone else, the hidden sorrow in a teacher's forced smile, the way laughter sometimes hid a fracture too deep to mend with words. Morty didn't intervene, didn't try to solve it all. He simply held it, as if carrying the unspoken stories of others was its own act of kindness. When a friend asked why he was staring off during class, Morty just smiled faintly and shook his head, just listening. The friend laughed awkwardly and moved on, not realizing that Morty had heard more than words ever could. That evening the dreams returned again, but this time they were different. Morty stood at the well of memory, its surface glowing with a softer light than before. Rick appeared beside him once more, but he was not the only one. Summer stepped into the reflection, her image bending and multiplying across the rippling water. They stood together at the edge, three shadows united, watching the echoes of themselves shimmer below. The reflections no longer felt chaotic. They moved with rhythm, like dancers in a silent waltz. Tiny Rick's guitar strummed in the distance, not playful this time, but slow, steady, almost reverent. Summer spoke first. "It's like the water remembers us, even when we forget ourselves." Rick snorted, but it lacked its usual sharpness. "Memories aren't sacred, Summer. They're just neurons firing, tricks of chemistry." Morty looked at him gently. "But they matter anyway, don't they? Even if they're just sparks, they're what makes us us." Rick didn't reply, but his reflection wavered, and Morty thought he saw a younger version of his grandfather in the water. Eyes brighter, posture less heavy, carrying a spark before cynicism had set in. Rick's silence lingered, and for once he didn't push it away. When Morty woke from the dream, the image of the well stayed with him, pressing quietly against his thoughts. That day, the family moved through their routines, but something had shifted. Rick spoke less, though his mutters were less harsh. Summer rolled her eyes less often, as though her annoyance had softened into patience. Even his parents seemed caught in a gentler rhythm, though they would never name it. Morty carried the sense that the silence between them all was beginning to teach them things they hadn't known how to say aloud. That night, unable to resist the pull of the stars, Morty stepped outside again. The sky stretched vast above him, and he lay down on the grass, his breath fogging faintly in the cool air. He thought of all the reflections, all the echoes, and how each of them, whether bright or broken, was part of a song, still unfolding. Summer joined him after a while, lying silently beside him. Rick appeared too, though he didn't lie down. He simply stood, staring upward, muttering something about the insignificance of stars. But Morty noticed how long Rick stayed, how his hands trembled less when they hung at his sides, how his silence spoke more than any of his words. As Morty's eyes grew heavy, he whispered once more into the night, not expecting an answer but needing to say it. "I'll keep listening, for all of us." And in that moment, he felt it again, the faint, unbroken melody of Tiny Rick's guitar, strumming softly across the sky, threading his family together with notes only they could hear. The sound lingered long after Morty drifted into sleep, like a promise stretching into the stars. The night released Morty gently, as if reluctant to let him go, and morning arrived with a hush that felt almost sacred. He rose slowly, his body moving as though still half attuned to the dream, where stars and guitar strings blurred into one. The memory of the well lingered, its reflections still rippling in his mind, carrying fragments of Rick and Summer and himself, woven together like threads in a tapestry. He didn't feel burdened by it. Instead, he felt steadied, as though those echoes had become part of his breath, guiding him without needing to speak. In the kitchen, the family sat gathered in the faint morning light. Rick, uncharacteristically, had made coffee for everyone, though he pretended it was purely for himself. Summer sipped from her mug, eyes softer than usual, her voice quieter. Morty ate in silence, but it wasn't an empty silence. It was alive, like soil waiting for seeds. Even Beth and Jerry, whose voices often filled the house with friction, spoke less sharply, as if something invisible had slowed them down, reminded them of gentler tones. Morty noticed all of it, storing it away like fragile glass that might shatter if held too tightly. At school, the same rhythm followed him. The noise of crowded hallways, the chatter of classrooms, even the petty arguments. It all carried a strange softness now. Morty watched a kid struggling to tie their shoelaces, and without overthinking it, he knelt to help. His movements simple and wordless. The kid blinked at him, confused, then nodded awkwardly before hurrying off. Morty didn't need thanks. He understood that sometimes the smallest gestures were enough, ripples spreading farther than anyone realized. That evening, Rick called him back into the garage. The machine still pulsed faintly, its glass glowing with a steady rhythm, no longer wild or erratic. "Morty," Rick muttered, "this thing's not broken anymore. It's tuned, but it's not tuned to anything I designed. It's like it's listening to something else, something I can't explain." He rubbed his forehead, frustrated, but his voice lacked its usual bite. Morty stepped closer, peering into the glow. He didn't fully understand the machine, but he recognized the feeling. Maybe it's listening the way we do. Not for answers, but for meaning. Rick gave him a long look, then snorted, though softer than usual. "Since when did you start talking like a fortune cookie?" Morty smiled faintly but said nothing. They stood together, watching the machine hum as if it carried the same hidden melody that threaded through Morty's dreams. That night, the well appeared again, but this time it wasn't only a place of reflection. The water shimmered brighter and the sound of the guitar grew stronger, no longer distant but near, circling them like a heartbeat. Rick stood on one side, Summer on the other, Morty in between. The reflections below didn't just show fragments, they showed connections. Rick handing Morty tools when he was small, Summer whispering comfort during nights he couldn't sleep. Moments that had seemed ordinary but now glowed with weight. They realized the well wasn't about showing them infinite versions of who they could be. It was reminding them of the quiet threads that bound them already, the invisible music they had been part of all along. Summer whispered, "It's like the well remembers us better than we remember ourselves." Morty squeezed her hand gently. Rick stared at the water for a long time, his jaw tight, then muttered, "Or maybe it just refuses to let us forget." For once there was no bitterness in his tone, only the ache of someone who understood too much and yet needed to be reminded of the simple things. Morty glanced at him, and though Rick didn't meet his eyes, Morty felt the smallest shift. A man not yet healed but softening, little by little. When Morty awoke, the dream clung to him like dew on grass, fresh and fragile. He carried it through the day, through small acts of kindness, through the way he noticed people's pauses more than their words. He began to realize that his strange ability wasn't about seeing deeper truths or carrying heavier burdens. It was about presence, about being there when silence mattered more than speech. That evening, under the glow of the stars, Morty lay again on the grass. Summer joined him first, her quiet presence steady beside him. Then, to Morty's surprise, Rick stepped out of the garage, muttering something about needing fresh air. He didn't sit, but he lingered, staring at the sky as though daring it to speak back. Morty closed his eyes, breathing slowly, and felt it again, the gentle strum of the guitar, no longer faint but woven into the night itself. He whispered, almost to himself but loud enough for them to hear, "We're all part of the same song." Summer leaned her head against his shoulder. Rick didn't reply, but he stayed, and that was enough. The night deepened around them, the silence wrapping them like a blanket. Morty let his eyes close, trusting that the melody would carry him where words could not, and as sleep folded over him, he knew the well would be waiting, shimmering with echoes not of what they had lost, but of what they had always carried within. The night lingered in quiet breaths, and when morning returned, it did so gently, as though it knew the house was learning how to hold its fragile balance. Morty stirred awake with the faintest hum still pressing against his chest, a resonance that had become as much a part of him as his own heartbeat. He blinked against the soft light of dawn, the echoes of the well still swimming in his mind, not like dreams that fade but like something etched deeper, refusing to loosen its grip. He rose, each step slow but steady, as though he carried within him the rhythm of an unseen song. At breakfast, the family gathered again. Though the table felt different now, Rick sat slouched as always, but his silence was less sharp, less like a wall and more like a door left half open. Summer scrolled idly through her phone, though she glanced at Morty more than once, a quiet acknowledgement that she too carried the echoes of the dream well. Beth and Jerry bickered lightly, but even that friction seemed dulled, as if the house itself had taught them how to soften their edges. Morty sat quietly, eating without rush, listening to every pause between words. It was in those pauses that he felt the music most alive. When he walked to school, the world seemed to lean closer. The air was thick with the scent of rain, though the sky was clear and the leaves shifted as though whispering among themselves. Morty noticed the way people's eyes carried weight, the teacher hiding her tiredness behind a smile, a friend masking nerves with a laugh, a stranger gripping their backpack as if it anchored them against invisible tides. Morty no longer felt separate from these glimpses. He carried them gently, like fragile glass, not to fix them but to honor them. Yet even in this rhythm, the hum of the machine called to him. That evening, Rick summoned him into the garage once again. The device pulsed with a stronger glow now, steady but not mechanical. It beat like something alive. Rick tapped the side of it, his expression caught between fascination and unease. Maybe I've built a lot of things, but this thing isn't mine anymore. It's adapting to something out there, or in here. He pointed vaguely toward Morty's chest. Morty swallowed, his pulse matching the glow. He didn't know how to answer, but he sensed that the machine wasn't simply responding to him. It was listening through him, the way the well had reflected not just images but connections. That night the dream returned with sharper clarity. The well shimmered brighter than before, its waters deep but inviting. The reflections didn't just flicker randomly. They formed patterns, threads that connected one moment to another. Morty saw Rick's hands stained with grease, guiding him as a child to hold a wrench correctly. He saw Summer's laughter breaking through a night when fear had gripped him. He saw his mother's quiet touch when he was sick, Jerry's clumsy attempts to make him smile. Each memory wasn't isolated. It wove together into something whole, something that pulsed with life. The guitar strummed softly in the background, no longer distant but within reach, every note echoing the truth that none of them had ever truly been alone. Rick stood across the water staring at his own reflection, but it didn't show his usual defiance. Instead, it showed him bending down beside Morty, silent but present. Summer appeared beside Morty, her hand brushing his, steady and warm. "It's not showing us what we want," she whispered. "It's showing us what we've always had but never saw." Morty nodded, though his throat tightened. Rick's jaw clenched, his voice rough when he finally spoke. "Or maybe it's just forcing us to admit the things we keep ignoring." His words hung heavy, but they weren't harsh. They trembled with the weight of someone realizing truths he'd long buried. When Morty awoke, his heart was full and aching all at once. He carried the dream through the day, its edges sharpening how he noticed the world. At lunch, he offered his seat to someone who needed it more. He lingered to hold a door for a stranger. None of it was grand, but each gesture was like striking a chord in the invisible song that had begun to guide him. He didn't speak of it to anyone, not even Summer, but he could feel it growing, spreading beyond him. That evening, Rick was waiting in the garage, arms crossed, eyes narrowed, not with anger but with uncertainty. "Morty," he muttered, this machine, it's not just reflecting you, it's expanding. I've measured frequencies I can't account for. It's broadcast." Morty froze, his chest tightening as though the hum inside him resonated with the words. Rick ran a hand through his hair, frustration, battling awe. "If this keeps going, Morty, it won't just be you. It'll start touching everything. Everyone. And I don't know if that's a miracle or a disaster." Morty stepped closer, gazing into the soft pulse of the machine. "Maybe it's not about choosing. Maybe it's just what it has to do." Rick's eyes flicked to him, searching, but Morty didn't look away. For the first time, he wasn't just following Rick. He was standing beside him, steady and unshaken. At night, when Morty lay beneath the stars again, Summer beside him and Rick lingering just a few steps away, the hum of the unseen guitar swelled louder, carried on the wind. Morty closed his eyes, letting it wash over him, knowing the well would open again, knowing the song wasn't finished. It was only beginning, and this time it wouldn't stay contained to dreams. It was moving outward, into the world, into every silence, every pause, every connection waiting to be seen. And as the night deepened, Morty felt it, the shift of something vast yet intimate, as though the universe itself was holding its breath, waiting for the next note. The night had ended in a stillness that lingered in Morty's chest long after he opened his eyes. The hum was there, steady and deep, but it wasn't confined anymore. It moved beyond him, past the edges of the garage, slipping into the spaces between walls, streets, and people. Morty knew it before Rick confirmed it. Something had shifted. The song of the well wasn't theirs alone. It was reaching further. At breakfast, no one spoke of it directly, but everyone felt the change. Summer sat straighter, her usual sarcasm dulled by something she couldn't put into words. Beth's movements were quieter, her touch on the coffee pot lingering a second too long, as though she too had caught the rhythm echoing faintly around her. Jerry fiddled nervously with his spoon, tapping it against his bowl in a pattern that to Morty's ears wasn't random. It matched the hum. Morty glanced toward Rick, who stared into his mug with tired eyes, a man listening for a frequency no one else dared acknowledge out loud. School was no different. The noise of chatter and footsteps seemed arranged, not chaotic as if the day itself followed a hidden composition. Morty felt it in the hallway when two kids reached for the same locker and smiled instead of arguing. He felt it in the classroom where the usual restlessness quieted for a moment as sunlight spread across the desks, catching everyone's attention at once. It was small, almost invisible, but Morty knew the hum was threading itself into places where it had never belonged before. When he returned home, Rick was waiting in the garage, his tools untouched, his face drawn tight with lines of thought. The machine pulsed, brighter now, its glow spilling across the cluttered workbench. Rick gestured toward it without looking up. Morty, the readings are off the charts. I'm tracking resonance patterns from miles away. Hospitals, schools, city squares, hell, even traffic signals are syncing to it. Whatever this thing is, it's not contained anymore. It's bleeding into the fabric of everything. His voice carried a sharpness, but beneath it, Morty heard something rare. Fear. Morty stepped closer, his reflection bending in the polished surface of the machine. Isn't that good? People are changing, Rick. They're listening. Rick slammed his palm on the table, making the tools rattle. Morty, change doesn't come without consequence. You think the universe just lets something like this happen without snapping back? No, there's always a cost. Always. His gaze flicked to Morty, sharp and unflinching. And if this thing keeps pulling at you the way it does, that cost is gonna start with you. The word stung, but Morty didn't flinch. Deep inside, the hum grew stronger, steadying him, reminding him that fear wasn't the only lens to see through. That night, the dream well opened again, but it was different. The waters no longer reflected only the family. They showed streets, strangers, entire crowds moving with the same rhythm. The guitar strummed louder, weaving through their movements like an invisible conductor. Morty saw connections forming between people who never noticed each other before. A hand reaching out, a word spoken softly, instead of swallowed, a choice toward kindness, rather than indifference. The reflections were no longer confined to memory. They were expanding outward, alive and breathing in real time. But among the shimmering images, a shadow stirred. At the edges of the water, ripples darkened, distorting faces, breaking connections into fragments. Morty leaned forward, heart pounding, as the shadow coiled tighter, pressing against the boundary of the well. Summer appeared beside him in the dream, her brow furrowed, her hand gripping his arm. It's not just showing the good, Morty. It's warning us. Rick's voice rose from across the dream, sharp and cutting through the echoes. Every harmony breeds dissonance, Morty. You can't pull at the strings of reality without something snapping. Morty woke with a jolt, sweat clinging to his skin. The hum was louder now, no longer something hidden within him. It vibrated in the floor, the air, even in the quiet breaths of the house. Summer stood in the doorway, her eyes wide. You felt it too, didn't you? She whispered. Morty nodded, unable to speak, because he knew she wasn't just talking about the dream. She had felt the tremor in the world itself. The following day, news screens in the living room flickered with strange reports. Crowds gathering in silence, listening to nothing yet moving as one. Machines failing in unison, only to restart moments later. Perfectly synchronized. People describing dreams of music, of water, of voices they didn't know yet, somehow recognized. Morty's chest tightened as he listened. This wasn't just his burden anymore. The song had spread, and now the world was hearing it. Rick paced behind the couch, muttering under his breath, formulas spilling from his lips like desperate prayers. It's accelerating. I thought it would stabilize, but it's not. It's converging. Morty, if this doesn't stop, it won't just be Earth. It'll bleed out into the cosmos. You've seen how fragile universes are. One wrong vibration. He snapped his fingers. Collapse. Morty turned to him, his voice low but steady. Then maybe it's not wrong, maybe it's what's supposed to happen. Rick froze, his eyes narrowing, studying Morty as though seeing him for the first time. There was no hesitation in Morty's face. No trembling. The boy who once followed reluctantly was gone, replaced by someone standing at the threshold of something larger than either of them could control. That night, Morty went outside, lying on the grass beneath a sky that seemed to hum with him. Summer joined quietly, resting beside him without words. Rick stood in the shadows of the porch, watching, torn between stepping forward and holding back. The stars above shimmered faintly, not as distant lights but as notes in an endless song, waiting for the next chord. And as Morty closed his eyes, he felt the dream well stirring again. But this time, it wasn't pulling him inward. It was opening outward, spilling its song into the vastness of the world. The guitar strummed once more, its sound resonating beyond dreams, into waking life, into the universe itself. The air was thick with the sense of something beginning, something inevitable. The song was no longer just his. It belonged to everyone now, and the universe, wide and trembling, was listening. The stars above seemed to lean closer that night, as if the universe itself was straining to hear the song that had spilled from Morty's heart into the fabric of everything. The hum was no longer a hidden thread. It was a tide that moved through cities, through dreams, through quiet corners where no one thought anyone was listening. People paused mid-step, caught by a strange calm they couldn't explain. Strangers shared glances that felt like recognition, but beneath the harmony, something restless stirred, like a shadow pacing just beyond the edge of light. Morty felt it as soon as he woke. The hum that had once soothed him now carried a weight, a faint discord humming under the surface like a splinter in a song. It wasn't loud, but it was undeniable. Summer met his gaze across the breakfast table, her eyes reflecting the same unease. Rick, though silent, moved with a sharper edge, every motion precise and heavy. He didn't need to say it. He had heard the shadow too. The news channels showed gatherings that defied explanation. Entire streets falling quiet as if listening to something unspoken. Groups of people humming in unison, without knowing why. And then the darker stories, machines glitching, lights flickering, voices on the radio bending into static whispers that carried words no one could repeat. Morty's chest tightened as he watched, his mind returning to the dream well, to the ripples where the shadow had pressed against the surface. Rick slammed the remote on the table, the sound sharp against the quiet. This is it. The feedback loop. The well, or whatever dimension it's bleeding from, can't hold the resonance anymore. It's pushing through. Morty, this isn't evolution. It's destabilization. And when that shadow breaks fully through, it's not gonna hum. It's going to consume. His voice was fierce, but Morty saw the wear in his eyes, the rare glimmer of fear. Morty didn't argue. Instead, he closed his eyes and listened. Beneath the hum, beneath the discord, he felt a heartbeat. Not his own, not Rick's, not even Earth's. Something older, deeper, waiting. It wasn't only chaos. It wasn't only danger. It was a call, an invitation into something beyond understanding. He thought of Tiny Rick's guitar, of how even in its simplest chord, there had been beauty. Maybe the shadow wasn't an enemy, but a missing note in the song. That night, the dream well opened again. This time, Morty didn't stand at its edge. He was pulled beneath the water, his body dissolving into ripples of light and sound. The echoes swirled around him, faces of people he had seen, moments he had lived, fragments of futures not yet born, and at the center of it, the shadow coiled, vast and silent. It didn't attack, it waited. Morty reached toward it, his hand trembling not with fear but with recognition. The shadow leaned closer, and for a heartbeat, he thought he saw his own face in its shifting form. Summer's voice called out in the dream, distant but urgent. Morty, don't let it take you. But Morty shook his head, though she couldn't see it. He whispered into the darkness. It's not here to take. It's here to be heard. The shadow pulsed, a vibration that rattled through the dream, through him, through everything. When he woke, gasping, Rick was there, watching. What did you see? He demanded. Morty wiped his face with shaking hands, his voice quiet but steady. It's not just a shadow. It's part of the song. It's the piece we've been missing. Rick turned away, muttering, That's not science, Morty. That's wishful thinking. But his voice lacked conviction. He knew, deep down, that Morty had touched something real. The following days blurred. The hum grew stronger, and so did the disturbances. Buildings shook without warning. Skies darkened at noon. People reported seeing shapes and reflections that weren't their own. Fear spread, but so did a strange reverence. Some saw it as a sign of destruction, others as a new beginning. Morty carried both truths within him, walking through hallways that felt less like school and more like thresholds into something vast. One evening, as the family sat together in uneasy silence, Summer finally spoke. What if it's not about stopping it or controlling it? What if it's about trusting it? Her words hung in the air, fragile but undeniable. Beth reached across the table, her hand brushing Summer's, a gesture of quiet agreement. Even Jerry, lost and confused, didn't pull away. Rick stood abruptly, pacing, his mind a storm. But Morty stayed seated, listening to the hum, to the dissonance, to the shadow pressing closer. He realized then that this wasn't just his burden, nor Rick's invention gone wrong. It was something that belonged to all of them, to everyone touched by the song. That night, Morty lay beneath the stars again. The sky shimmered not with stillness but with motion, constellations flickering as though they too were part of the melody. He closed his eyes and whispered, "If you're listening, I'm ready." The air trembled, the grass bent, and the hum swelled. Not soothing now, but vast, filling every space, carrying both harmony and shadow within it. And as Morty drifted into sleep, the well opened wider than ever before. The shadow no longer waited at the edges. It was rising, merging with the light, with the song, with him. The world held its breath. The night stretched long, though Morty could no longer tell where night truly began or ended. The hum had grown so constant it seemed to live in his bones. Not as a sound, but as a condition of existence. Even silence carried it now. Every pause thrumming with an unseen rhythm. The shadow that had once lingered at the edge of his dreams no longer hid. It stood within the light, inseparable from it, folding darkness and brightness into one shape that pulsed like a great and patient heartbeat. Morty drifted in and out of restless sleep, each moment carrying him deeper into visions where the well no longer appeared as water but as a vast horizon, rippling with colors too soft and strange to name. The shadow waited for him there, neither menacing nor kind, simply present. Its form shifted, sometimes his own reflection, sometimes Rick's, sometimes no one at all. Morty felt no urge to run from it. Instead, he breathed with it, the rhythm of his chest aligning with the rhythm of the shadow, until he couldn't tell where his own breath ended and its pulse began. When morning arrived, the house felt unsettled. Plates rattled faintly, even when no one touched them. The lights flickered in gentle patterns as though responding to some hidden command. Beth moved carefully, every motion slowed, her gaze drifting toward Morty with unspoken worry. Summer hovered at his side, her presence less protective now and more companioned, like someone walking into the same storm willingly. Rick had been awake all night in the garage, his muttering louder than usual, though when Morty entered, he found the old man staring at the machine without working on it, his tools scattered but unused. "Morty," Rick said at last, his voice hoarse, "I've run every calculation. None of it matters anymore. The resonance isn't coming from the machine, it's coming through it. And you're the anchor. You've been the anchor all along." His gaze hardened, but the weight in his eyes was not anger. It was recognition, and something close to resignation. "The shadow you saw, it's not external. It's you, or at least the part of you the universe has been trying to ignore." The words settled heavy, but Morty didn't recoil. He thought of the well, of the dream's reflections, of the way the shadow had carried his face for a fleeting moment. Deep down he had already known. It was not something foreign to be fought. It was something long hidden waiting to be acknowledged. That evening, the world outside rippled with the strain. Sirens rang across the city, not in chaos but in strange synchrony, each wail rising and falling with the same tempo. On the news, people described waking dreams, visions of water and music, some weeping with awe, others trembling with dread. A crowd gathered downtown, hundreds of strangers standing together in silence, eyes lifted skyward as though they could hear the same unspoken song. Morty stepped outside, Summer and Rick following close. The air itself seemed alive, vibrating with threads of light that bent around them. Morty felt the shadow surge within his chest, a deep pull drawing him forward. He turned to Rick, his voice quiet but steady. "I have to meet it, not in the dream here. In this world." Rick gritted his teeth, shaking his head. "Morty, you're a kid. You don't get to decide for the universe." But even as he spoke, his voice cracked, betraying the truth that Morty had already decided. Summer touched Morty's arm, her grip warm and firm. "We'll go with you," she whispered, though her voice trembled. That night, Morty lay once more beneath the stars, but this time he did not drift gently into dream. The hum crescendoed, vibrating through every nerve, until the world itself seemed to unravel. The sky rippled like water, stars bending and collapsing into streaks of light. From the horizon, the shadow rose, not looming as an enemy, but unfolding as part of the same song, vast and encompassing. It filled the sky, and within its shifting form, Morty saw every version of himself, every choice unmade, every quiet regret. Summer's hand slipped into his, grounding him as the enormity of it threatened to sweep him away. Rick stood behind them, silent for once, without an answer. The shadow leaned close, its vastness pressing against Morty's heart. For a moment, everything inside him screamed to resist, but then he remembered the small acts, the unnoticed details, the way he had listened to people in hallways, the way the hum had brought strangers together. He whispered, "I see you. You're not separate. You're me." The shadow shuddered, the vibration spreading through the earth itself. For an instant, Morty thought the world would tear apart, but instead the resonance deepened, harmonizing the dissonance into something fuller and more complete. The sky stilled, the hum softened, and the shadow dissolved into light that lingered, not gone but woven into everything. Morty sank to the ground, exhausted, his body trembling as though it had carried the weight of ages. Summer knelt beside him, brushing hair from his forehead. "Is it over?" she asked, her voice breaking. Morty opened his mouth, then closed it. He didn't know, but the air was quiet now, not empty, but at peace, as if the universe itself had taken a long breath and finally exhaled. Rick stepped forward at last, his gaze fixed on Morty, his voice low and tired. "You didn't fix it, Morty. You became part of it. Maybe that's the only way it ever works." His words held no bitterness, only a reluctant reverence. As the night settled, Morty lay back against the grass, the stars clearer than he had ever seen them. The hum still lingered faintly, but it no longer pulled at him. It moved with him, inside him, like a companion that had finally found its voice. And in the stillness, with Summer beside him, and Rick watching from the shadows, Morty closed his eyes and whispered, "Thank you." The world answered, not with sound, but with quiet. The grass beneath Morty's back was damp with evening dew, though he barely noticed. His body felt light, emptied, as if the weight he had carried for so long had finally dispersed into the air. The stars above gleamed sharper, steadier, no longer distorted by ripples of unseen resonance. For the first time in what felt like forever, the silence was truly silence, gentle, still, and whole. But within that calm lingered a question, unspoken yet undeniable. What happens after something vast has been released? Summer's grip had not loosened. Her hand remained in his, her presence anchoring him as the enormity of what had passed still vibrated faintly in his chest. She studied his face with cautious relief, her expression caught between pride and fear, like someone who had watched a fragile bridge hold against impossible weight. Rick stood a few feet away, shoulders hunched, his silhouette stark against the pale starlight. He didn't speak right away, and the absence of his voice felt almost unnatural. Finally, Rick exhaled, some rough and uneven. "Morty," he muttered, "what you did back there, it wasn't survival, it wasn't victory, it was surrender." And sometimes, his voice faltered, a pause thick with something he rarely allowed. Sometimes surrender's the only thing that works. The words lingered, strange coming from him. Morty turned his head toward Rick, searching his expression for irony, but found none. For once Rick wasn't hiding behind sarcasm or anger. His face was weary, his eyes red-rimmed, his whole frame burdened with the kind of exhaustion that didn't come from work, but from witnessing something too large to put into language. Morty pushed himself upright, though his limbs trembled. The hum had quieted, but it hadn't vanished. It was different now, woven into him rather than pressing against him. Every breath he took seemed to carry a faint echo of the song he had heard in the shadow. "I don't think it's over," he whispered. "I think it's just different." Summer leaned closer, her brow furrowed. "Different how?" "Like, dangerous, different, or..." Morty shook his head slowly. "Not dangerous, just connected. Like it's everywhere now, not trying to tear things apart, but holding them together." His voice softened, as though the words weren't really his but borrowed. "It's not something we can fix or stop. It's just part of us." The three of them sat in silence, the air cool and steady around them. Far in the distance, faint lights flickered across the horizon. Not explosions, not chaos, but subtle shimmering waves of color, like the afterglow of a storm retreating beyond the edges of the world. It wasn't destruction, it was renewal. Days passed differently after that night. The city, once restless with flickering lights and trembling foundations, grew calm. People spoke of strange dreams less often, though now and then Morty would catch fragments in conversations on street corners, someone mentioning the feeling of being seen in their sleep, another describing water that reflected not faces but feelings. No one panicked anymore. They accepted it the way people accept the weather or the way a song lingers in memory long after it's gone. School. Morty walked through hallways that once felt hostile but now seemed softened, as if the very walls carried less weight. His classmates didn't mock him anymore, though they didn't exactly understand him either. They treated him differently, with a quietness he couldn't explain. Some glanced at him with suspicion, others with wonder, but no one dared say the things they used to. He felt like a stranger in a place that hadn't changed at all, except that somehow it had. Rick buried himself in his work, though not with the same frantic urgency. Morty often found him staring at the machine in the garage, not rebuilding it, but studying it, as though trying to decide whether to dismantle it completely or let it gather dust. When Morty asked, Rick only grunted, but Morty noticed the subtle difference in his tone. Less bitterness, more thoughtfulness, as if even Rick knew some things didn't need answers. The Summer grew restless in her own way, pacing the house at odd hours, standing at windows as though waiting for the horizon to speak again. Yet she never strayed far from Morty. Whenever the hum rose faintly in his chest, she would appear beside him, wordless but steady. She had felt it too in her own way, and though she couldn't explain it, she refused to let him carry it alone. One night, Morty woke with a start. The hum was stronger again, not overwhelming, but insistent, tugging at him like a gentle hand pulling him out of bed. He rose quietly, careful not to wake anyone, and stepped outside. The air was cool, the moon pale and sharp above. At the edge of the yard, the shadow waited, not vast and towering as before, but small, almost human, its shape shifting in rhythm with his heartbeat. Morty froze, breath catching. For a moment, fear returned, but then he realized the shadow wasn't pressing against him. It was waiting. Slowly, he stepped closer, until the outline blurred into his own. He raised his hand, and the shadow raised its hand too, not as reflection, but as accompaniment. And in that moment, Morty understood. It wasn't gone. It would never be gone. It was him. Always had been, and always would be. Behind him, the door creaked. Summer's voice whispered, drowsy but firm. Morty, what are you doing? He glanced back, smiling faintly. Nothing. Just listening. The shadow faded with the dawn, but the hum remained, softer now, like a hidden melody he could carry without fear. As the first light spread across the horizon, Morty turned back toward the house, where Summer waited in the doorway, and Rick's figure stirred faintly in the garage beyond. For the first time, Morty didn't feel like he was being dragged through someone else's chaos. He wasn't just surviving Rick's adventures, or the world's distortions. He was part of something larger, something that didn't need to be solved, only lived. The universe no longer felt like a storm pressing in from outside. It felt like breath, it felt like belonging, and as Morty stepped back into the warmth of home, the hum followed, not a threat, not a curse, but a companion that would never leave. The morning light crept into the Smith household slowly, filling each corner with a calm brightness that felt foreign compared to the weeks of unrest they had endured. Morty sat at the kitchen table, staring at the steam rising from his untouched cereal. The hum lingered quietly within him, not invasive, not commanding, but steady, like a second heartbeat. It was a presence that no longer threatened to pull him apart, but instead reminded him of the night when everything shifted. He had made peace with it, at least on the surface, yet beneath that calm lay a question that refused to dissolve. If the shadow was now part of him, what did that mean for the future? Lich entered the kitchen bleary-eyed, clutching a mug of coffee that smelled stronger than anything human should consume. He didn't comment on Morty's untouched food or the silence that filled the room. Instead, he sat down across from him, elbows on the table, gaze fixed on something distant. The quiet between them wasn't uncomfortable, but it was fragile. You're holding it together better than I expected, Rick finally muttered, his voice low and rough. Most people who brush against that, they don't come back. Not whole anyway. Morty blinked, unsure whether to take it as a compliment or a warning. I don't feel broken, he said carefully. I just feel different, like I can't go back to how things were. Rick's eyes flicked up, sharp and unyielding. You're right, you can't. None of us can. The words landed heavier than Morty expected, and he realized Rick wasn't just talking about him. The events that had unfolded hadn't only changed Morty, they had changed Rick too. His grandfather's walls, usually fortified by sarcasm and cynicism, seemed thinner now. Morty could see through the cracks, glimpsing weariness that had always been there but never this exposed. Summer entered next, tying her hair back, her expression set in the quiet determination she had carried ever since the night of the shadow. She didn't say good morning, didn't ask how anyone was feeling. She just slid into a chair beside Morty and looked at him. It's not over, she said simply. Morty nodded. He knew it wasn't. The shadow might no longer loom, but its presence within him felt like a promise, not an ending. He thought of the shimmer on the horizon, the faint dreams whispered by strangers in town, the way the air sometimes pulsed as if the world was still adjusting to the resonance. Whatever had been released wasn't gone. It was spreading, finding its way into corners they hadn't yet seen. Rick sighed, running a hand down his face. The problem with surviving something like this, he said, is that it doesn't just end with survival. It changes the rules. And when rules change, the universe notices. The words lingered long after breakfast ended. Over the next days, Morty began to notice subtleties. Others didn't. He could hear things no one else could. The faint stirrings of wind that carried whispers and tones too low to be language, the hidden vibrations beneath a distant engine's growl, the murmur of water that seemed to recognize him as he passed. None of it felt threatening. It was simply there, a world layered over the world he had always known. Yet with it came responsibility he hadn't asked for, but couldn't ignore. Summer stayed close. She seemed to sense when the hum within Morty grew stronger, pulling him outside or waking him in the middle of the night. She asked fewer questions now, not because she didn't want answers, but because she trusted him to share when he was ready. Her presence was enough, an anchor reminding him that even as things shifted beyond comprehension, he was not drifting alone. Rick, however, grew restless. He spent more time in the garage than ever, not rebuilding the machine, but constructing something else entirely. Morty caught glimpses, coils humming with faint energy, crystalline shards suspended in magnetic fields, a framework of equations scrawled across every wall. Rick never explained what he was building, and Morty didn't push, but the tension in his movements told Morty that whatever it wasn't meant to fix what had happened. It was meant to prepare for what was coming. One evening, as the sky bled orange into purple, Morty wandered out into the yard. The air felt thicker, as though dusk itself carried weight. He sat in the grass, breathing slowly, letting the hum resonate through him. The ground beneath his palms vibrated faintly, and when he closed his eyes, he saw shapes, patterns of light threading through the earth, through the trees, through the air itself. It was as if the world had veins, glowing softly, pulsing with rhythm that matched his own heartbeat. A voice startled him, not out loud, but inside him. It wasn't the shadow's voice, not exactly, but something woven from it, a thread that had become part of him. Do you hear it? Morty swallowed hard, eyes snapping open. The yard looked the same, but the question lingered. Yeah, he whispered. I hear it. Summer's voice called from behind him, breaking the moment. Morty, you okay? He turned, forcing a smile. Yeah, just thinking. But as they went inside, he realized the voice hadn't left. It wasn't speaking constantly. It was patient, quiet, waiting, and he understood then that whatever connection he had forged wasn't passive. It was alive. That night, Morty dreamt vividly. He stood in a vast plain of darkness, not oppressive, but infinite, dotted with faint lights like distant stars. The shadow appeared again, not towering, not overwhelming, but walking beside him, its form shifting fluidly, mirroring his steps. It didn't speak with words, but its presence carried meaning. It showed him flashes, cities flickering with resonance, skies bending under unseen waves, people standing in awe and fear of changes they couldn't control. The message was clear. This wasn't confined to him or to his family. It was spreading across realities. Morty woke with his heart pounding, sweat clinging to his forehead. The hum was louder now, almost insistent. He sat up, staring into the darkness of his room, and whispered, "Why me?" The only answer was silence, but the silence carried weight. He wasn't chosen by chance. He was chosen because he had survived, because he had surrendered when others would have resisted. That surrender had bound him to the resonance, and now it moved through him as much as through the universe itself. In the morning, he found Rick waiting for him in the garage, eyes bloodshot, hands stained with ink and grease. The machine he had been building loomed in the center, incomplete but already humming faintly, its energy thrumming in sync with the hum inside Morty. Rick didn't look at him at first, but his voice was steady when he finally spoke. "You're the tether now," Rick said. "This thing, whatever it is, it's not gonna leave you. Which means it's not gonna leave us. So either we learn to live with it, or we prepare for the next wave. And trust me, kid, there will be a next wave." Morty's throat tightened. He wanted to deny it, to believe that what had happened was enough, but deep down he knew Rick was right. The shadow's presence wasn't an ending. It was a beginning. Summer entered, catching the tension instantly. She crossed her arms, eyes hard but determined. "Then we don't wait for the next wave to hit. We stand ready." Rick smirked faintly, though it didn't reach his eyes. "That's the spirit." Morty glanced between them, the hum steady in his chest, the memory of the dream burning in his mind. For the first time, he felt the weight of what lay ahead, not as fear, but as inevitability. The shadow had not cursed him, nor freed him. It had given him a role, one he didn't fully understand yet, but could no longer run from. As the three of them stood in the garage, surrounded by the low thrum of unfinished machinery and the faint vibrations threading through the walls of reality, Morty knew their story was far from over. What had begun as chaos and fear was evolving into something larger, something that would demand everything from them. And as the hum resonated in unison with the machine Rick was building, Morty felt it clearly for the first time. The world wasn't waiting. It was already shifting. The nights grew heavier after Rick's words, as though the air itself knew the truth they were circling but hadn't yet spoken aloud. Morty carried the hum with him like an invisible companion, steady and soft, yet too vast to ignore. It was no longer only a rhythm in his chest. It reached outward, brushing against the quiet corners of the universe, and pulling back fragments of what lay there. Sometimes it was only a whisper of sound, or a fleeting vision behind closed eyes. Other times it was something stronger. A sensation of being watched, not by malice, but by expectation. Rick worked relentlessly in the garage, his hands never still, his muttering never ceasing. The machine grew day by day, evolving into something that looked less like science and more like a vessel carved from equations and instinct. Morty didn't understand it fully, but he didn't need to. He felt what Rick felt, that this wasn't about invention anymore, it was about survival, about building a bridge before the ground gave way beneath them. Summer drifted between them, her role quieter now but no less important. She was the steady rhythm in their days, grounding Morty when the hum swelled too loud, pulling Rick out of his spiral when he forgot to eat or sleep. Morty sometimes wondered if she felt it too, the resonance that threaded through him, and by proximity through them, but if she did, she never admitted it. She simply stayed close, her presence like a hand on his shoulder in the dark. It was during one of those nights when the house was hushed and Rick's muttering carried faintly from the garage that Morty woke suddenly. Not from a dream, not from a noise, he simply woke, heart thrumming, the hum inside him urgent and insistent. He sat up, breath caught in his throat, and for a moment the darkness of his room shimmered. Lines of light traced across the walls and ceiling, delicate and fluid, forming patterns like constellations that flickered and faded before his eyes. He whispered into the silence, "What do you want me to see?" And the silence answered, not with words, but with an image that filled his mind, a place far from their house, yet intimately connected, a wide plain under a violet sky, where people stood clustered in fear, staring at the horizon. From that horizon came waves of resonance, like the hum within him, but fractured, unstable, breaking apart the air itself. Morty felt their fear as if it were his own, and he understood the resonance wasn't bound to him alone. It was spreading, touching other worlds, other lives, calling out to him across distances that should have been impossible. When morning came, he told Rick. The old man didn't flinch, didn't question. It was as though he had been waiting for this moment. "I knew it wouldn't stop here," Rick muttered, pacing the garage with his flask in hand. "The universe doesn't work like that. You light a match this big. You don't just burn one corner. You set the whole damn forest on fire." Morty hesitated. "They're scared, Rick. I could feel it. They don't know what's happening." Rick turned sharply, eyes bloodshot but fierce. "And you think you can fix it? That you can hold their hands and tell them it'll be fine? You're a tether, Morty, not a savior. Don't confuse the two." The word stung, but beneath the sting was a truth Morty couldn't deny. He wasn't sure if he had the power to fix what was breaking, but he couldn't ignore it either. The hum within him wasn't content with silence. It demanded connection, demanded that he listen, even if he didn't understand. That evening, as the sun dipped low and shadows lengthened across the yard, the machine in the garage stirred to life for the first time. Its coils glowed faintly and a low vibration filled the air, harmonizing with the resonance inside Morty's chest until it felt like the two were breathing together. Rick stood before it, jaw tight, and for once his expression wasn't clouded by cynicism. It was stripped bare, revealing the scientist beneath the armor. "This isn't just a machine," Rick said, almost to himself. "It's a compass. A way to track the resonance, to follow where it spreads. Maybe even a way to redirect it." Summer frowned. "Redirect it where?" Rick didn't answer, and that silence said more than words could. That night, Morty stood outside alone, staring up at the stars. The hum pulsed in his chest, and he felt them differently now. Not as distant fires, but as nodes in a vast web, each one trembling faintly with the same resonance that lived inside him. It was beautiful and terrifying all at once, like holding a map of infinity and knowing you were part of it. He whispered softly, "If I'm the tether, then maybe I'm supposed to carry it, not just for me, but for them." The wind stirred, cool against his face, And for a fleeting moment, he thought he heard an answer, not from the shadow, not from the universe, but from somewhere deep within himself. You are not alone. And he believed it. When he returned inside, Summer was waiting in the hallway, her expression unreadable. She studied him for a long moment before speaking. You're changing, Morty. Not just because of this thing, because of you. You're stronger than you were before. He didn't know how to respond, so he simply nodded. But her words settled into him, weaving into the hum, giving it shape. The next morning, Rick announced that the machine was ready. His hands trembled as he adjusted the last coil, his voice low but steady. Wherever this resonance is spreading, we'll find it. But understand this. Once we go looking, we can't pretend it doesn't exist anymore. There's no turning back. Morty met his gaze, his chest steady with the hum. I know, but we can't ignore it either. Rick smirked faintly, though there was no humor in it. Guess we're all in, then. The machine roared to life, filling the garage with light and vibration. The resonance inside Morty surged in response, guiding, pulling, aligning with the energy that Rick had captured. For a moment, it felt as though the entire universe exhaled through him, threads of light connecting from their small garage to places beyond imagination. And as the light grew brighter, Morty understood this was the threshold. Beyond it lay the next wave, the wider story, the countless lives touched by the resonance that now lived in him. He wasn't stepping into battle or conquest. He was stepping into responsibility, into the quiet, impossible task of being the bridge between worlds. The garage faded around them, replaced by the shimmer of horizons unseen. Summer's hand found as Rick's muttering fell into silence and the hum within him stretched outward, reaching for what lay beyond. And with that, Morty felt it begin again, not an ending, but a widening, a ripple carrying them forward into the heart of what was waiting.